So this evening we're going to talk about mind-body interactions, the influence of consciousness on the state of health of the reproductive system, how mind-body interactions influence such things as pregnancy, what role do mind-body interactions have in the treatment of infertility. Also want to discuss with you a very exciting new area of research, and that is both the cognitive and psychological development of the unborn child and how that influences personality in later life. My own interest in this field began several years ago, actually, when I was visiting Japan, and I'll tell you about that in a little while. By now, I think it's very clear to everyone that Ayurveda is a science that's based on the understanding that consciousness or soul or spirit is primary, and the soul incarnates and expresses itself through the molecules which we call the body. The physical body is the place our memories, dreams, vasanas, sanskaras call home. And the analogy that I gave you the other day, that the nervous system is literally the instrument through which consciousness expresses itself. So we are the user of the instrument. We're not the instrument. We're the one who uses the instrument. And the nervous system is the instrument that consciousness, soul, spirit uses in order to express itself. And then the nervous system, of course, in turn uses the rest of the body to express itself. And consciousness conceives, governs, constructs, becomes from the unmanifest into the manifest. Just to go over a little bit of basics on physiology and endocrinology, how does our state of mind really have any effect on the whole reproductive cycle? And as you are probably aware, the reproductive cycle in women is a little more complicated than in men, because it requires a much more subtle and finer degree of orchestration and sequential secretion of hormones. And just want to go over very simple basics of this. The two primary hormones that are secreted by the pituitary that regulate ovulation are called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone and LH is luteinizing hormone. The function of the follicle stimulating hormone is to stimulate the growth of the egg in the ovary. I'm going to make this as simple as possible. So every month what happens is there are a lot of little eggs that the ovary has, and they all start to get stimulated by this hormone that is secreted by the pituitary gland. They all start growing, and follicle stimulating hormone does that. So during the first part of the menstrual cycle, the first 14 days, what you see is a gradual increase in the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. And all these little eggs start to grow, but then one is ahead of the others. And around mid-cycle, there's a sudden surge of the second hormone called luteinizing hormone. And that sudden surge causes one of all the eggs to fully mature. And as that one is fully matured from the ovary and released from the ovary into the fallopian tube, then all the other, and then suddenly there's a fall in both FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone during mid-cycle. And as that fall occurs, then one egg has matured, it's now in the fallopian tube, and all the others, they start to atrophy. And then that one egg goes through the fallopian tube, and if fertilization occurs, then of course fertilization usually occurs somewhere in the fallopian tube, and then the egg travels into the uterus and it finds its place over there, and the whole process of gestation starts. If for some reason this sequential secretion, because it's quite sequential, it's not the level of the hormone itself as much as it is the sequence in which this happens. FSH going up gradually, LH suddenly reaching a peak, and then both starting to fall. If that delicate sequence is disrupted, then there can be problems with ovulation. And one of the most frequent problems with ovulation is so-called anovulation, and it's also associated with a condition called polycystic ovaries, or polycystic ovaries disease, where you have both the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, but this delicate sequence isn't there. So you have, follicle-stimulating hormone being secreted and luteinizing hormone being secreted, but not in this delicate sequential manner. So what happens is all the eggs get mature almost at the same time. And because there's no LH surge, then all of them just get to maturity, but not even one of them actually gets to full maturity. And then when there's a drop, they don't all shrink. So by and by, if this cycle of anovulation keeps repeating itself, then what happens is you get little cysts in the ovaries. And if that process keeps going on, then that's called polycystic ovaries disease. And because there's this abnormal secretion all the time, the ovary doesn't make the right amount of estrogen, there is an abnormal production of testosterone, and then there can be all kinds of problems. Women may start developing hair in their face, they might start losing hair, they have polycystic ovaries, they get anovulation. It's one of the most common things that is responsible for infertility in women. Now, what I've described is a late stage where you get abnormal secretion even of male hormones, where you get cysts. Early stages of this condition called polycystic ovaries are just anovulation, nothing else, and so subtle that one really doesn't know what's happening, unless one monitors these hormone levels on a daily basis, because by just taking the hormone level on one particular day, it doesn't tell you anything. And what can disrupt that? Well, these hormones, LH and FSH, in turn are regulated by a hormone called gonadotrophin stimulating hormone, which is secreted again by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus rules the pituitary, and the pituitary rules the ovaries, and the ovaries, of course, produce estrogen, which is the main female hormone. And therefore, these disruptions are in fact now felt to be a result of something happening in the nervous system. And that something in the nervous system has to do with the sensory input and how it's being interpreted by the brain. So stress will cause abnormal secretion of gonadotrophin secreting hormone, abnormal sequential secretion of luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone, and therefore anovulation, one of the most common causes of infertility. And this is how it happens. Altered hypothalamic regulation of pituitary hormones, both luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone. And there is some direct effect. There are nerves that connect the brain to both the ovaries and the fallopian tube. That may also be contributing. So once that cycle starts, then you have all kinds of problems. You have decreased ovulation, you can have fallopian tube spasm, there is loss of sexual interest. In men, there is decreased sperm production. That causes, in turn, psychological problems. This whole vicious cycle becomes self-perpetuating. And by the time the couples recognize that there is this condition called infertility, and they go to a physician, it's actually so late that nobody even thinks that the origin of this could have been in consciousness, because now you have all this disruption of hormones, you have polycystic ovaries when you do a scan, so it's a very anatomical, biochemical thing, because it's so late and nobody recognizes that the origin of all that was actually in consciousness. So given that, and of course in men also there can be problems, although in men the effects of stress are not so easy to document, but some of these problems can occur. But usually it's anovulation that is the main problem. So given that, this kind of data started to emerge about 10, 15 years ago, and this was a study that was done in Harvard, where actually without doing any investigations, when people go for infertility, physicians will do things, fertility experts will do sperm counts, sperm motility, tests for hormone function, to see if there's a blockage in the fallopian tubes. There's so many possible causes. In this particular study, which was done from Harvard, they didn't do any of these tests. They did not investigate the cause of infertility, which, as I said, can be multifactorial. It can be an abnormal sperm count, it can be abnormal sperm activity, it can be fallopian tube spasm, fallopian tube blockage from an old infection, polycystic ovaries disease, many reasons. So they didn't do any of that. They just took these couples and actually just taught them meditation. Just that, and see what happened. Of 54 infertile women, using meditation, 34% became pregnant a few weeks after learning that, without all the expensive tests. And this has now been corroborated by many studies done by Dr. Benson and others. And there are other studies which show that when there are support groups where there's group meditation, we have a high incidence of conception as compared to control groups. So we know for sure that consciousness and the state of consciousness influences fertility. The second thing which is emerging is that once there is conception, and if there is a lot of stress during gestation, during pregnancy, that influences the development of the fetus into a fully developed baby. The stress consistently correlates with premature and low birth weights. A Finnish study revealed that if the baby's father died during the time when the mother was pregnant, then that correlated with greater dysfunctional adult behavior. If there was unwanted pregnancy, but it was carried through to term, and this was a Swedish study, there was a high incidence of birth defects, and so on. So this kind of data has existed also sporadically throughout the world's literature. Now what happened to me about 10 years ago was that I was traveling in Japan, and I was invited to give a talk at Sony Corporation, which has its headquarters in Japan. And the CEO and founder of Sony Corporation at that time was an elderly gentleman called Mr. Ibuka. He was about 88 years of age at that time. He's no longer alive. He's the original founder of Sony Corporation, really one of the most significant businessmen in the world. He's credited with having earned personally $250 billion over a lifetime. One of the richest men in the world at that time. But an amazingly insightful, spiritual being. And he invited me to give a talk at Sony headquarters on primordial sound meditation. And after the talk, he took me to his office and he said, I have something really very interesting to show you. Well, what he had been doing is, he had a lot of knowledge of primordial sound meditation. He had a lot of knowledge of Vedanta. He had a lot of knowledge of ancient Buddhist techniques. And he had started a program at Sony for pregnant mothers that were usually employees of Sony or wives of employees of Sony. And at this place, what he was doing was, he was first of all investigating the effect of sound on the unborn child. And he had collected all this information that revealed that consciousness comes to the unborn child first through sound. That's how consciousness becomes conscious in response to sound in the uterus. He had also collected all this information, scientific information, on how it is the acoustic apparatus that first develops in the unborn child. The first sensory input we have when we become conscious that there is a world, in this incarnation, is in utero, before we are born, very early in pregnancy, and I'll show you when. We start listening to sounds. We become aware that there is a world. And that awareness comes to us through sound. So it's the first experience of the world, incarnated material world. And by the way, it's also the last experience when we leave this incarnation. All the other senses go before. The last one to go is sound. It's the first and the last. And we begin to listen to the sounds that our mother's body makes first. And then we listen to the sounds, of course, her body, which means her heartbeat, the peristaltic movements of the intestines, all the other sounds that are being made. But then we start to listen to what she's listening to. And then we start to listen to what she's saying. And in fact, Deepak showed me very convincing studies that made it quite clear that not only do we listen to what she says and what she hears and the sounds that her body makes, but we listen to her thoughts. We, in utero, are aware of her thinking process. Because what is a thought? It's a vibration in consciousness. And that vibration in consciousness has biochemical effects. And of course, the biochemistry of the mother and the physiology of the baby is one continuum. And those biochemical effects are then reinterpreted in the consciousness of the unborn child. Now, there's some amazing studies on this. So, for example, if a woman gets pregnant and she doesn't want the baby, the incidence of spontaneous miscarriage is about 5 times as high as compared to if she wants the baby. If the mother starts to think, she's a smoker, if she starts to think, I want a cigarette, I'm going to have a cigarette, in response to that thought, the baby's heart rate starts to speed up. The blood pressure goes up. There's acid secretion in the stomach. There's peristaltic activity in the physiology, in the gut. So the baby's, even in anticipation of her smoking a cigarette, starts to kick and starts to have a stress response. There are all kinds of very fascinating data. But Deepak wasn't interested in disease processes. He was more interested in what does the Vedic literature have to say and what does the world's wisdom tradition have to say of how this, in fact, could be used, this knowledge could be used to nourish the personality of this soul that was trying to incarnate. So what he started doing is, in this school that he had in Sony Corporation, he started to teach the mothers primordial sound meditation. He started to teach them all the Vedic chants. He started to play Gandharva Veda type music, Vata, Pitta, Kapha balancing, depending on the physiology of the mother, because the idea is you balance the mother, you balance the child. he started to teach them chanting. Just so you know, the word enchantment comes from an, means to become one with the spirit through chanting. So enchantment is the magic that happens through chanting when you become one with the spirit. So he said, I'm going to enchant these mothers and these babies through sacred sounds and healing sounds. He started using mantras, he started using primordial sound meditation, he started using chants, he started using music, right from the day of conception. And then he said, not only am I going to do that, but since the nervous system is developing in response to sound, it seems, why not teach these babies language even before they're born? So he started teaching them 3 languages before they were born. The mothers would actually speak to they even developed an instrument called a phytone. Only Sony Corporation can do that, okay? Where the mother can now, take this little stethoscope-like thing and she can tell her baby this story and sing a song and lullaby and so on, and start having this great conversation with her baby and start telling the baby mythical stories, reading poetry to the baby and telling this baby stories. And in fact, they were doing this in 3 languages, and all the babies had names even before they were born. When I met him, these studies were in progress, and actually they had created a great excitement in Japan, because Sony Corporation is, of course, a very big thing in Japan. And they were showing ultrasound on TV. You could see that on television, as the mothers would meditate or go into restful alertness, you could see the baby relax in utero. You could see the smile on the ultrasound. If it was played music, there were sound-specific movements. And in fact, now it's documented that the nervous system develops in response to sound, and each letter of the alphabet, remember yesterday I was going over the sounds of the alphabet, each letter creates a different response in the baby. So for example, if you say, the baby's big toe will curl up, and only the big toe, to that sound. If you start playing symphonies and all this, the baby will respond to that post-birth as well. Anyway, so he created this absolutely astonishing program, which included many other things, and some of the things we'll be talking about. But starting with sound, poetry, mythology, storytelling, language instruction, chanting, mantra, meditation. And then during delivery, they would serenade the baby through the chanting and the music and so on. These babies would respond to their first name, which they had already received in utero, at the moment of birth. They would, if you called this baby's name, only this name it would respond to, not to any other name. They were very alert, high cognitive function, and they were easily multilingual. And the whole theory now is that the whole programming for language happens in utero. The more we hear language, the more adept we become, and even our vocabulary, the essence, the neural connections, interneuronal connections are established in utero in response to sound. So that was what Ibuka was doing 11 years ago. He died, he wrote a book before he died called Education Begins at Age 0. 0 meaning age of conception. And then after he died, the program also died at Sony Corporation. And I've been talking about it forever. And then I came here to San Diego and I started telling David about it. And we said we're going to one day really make use of this knowledge. Now, in the meanwhile, I started looking at all the research that exists. And this is quite astonishing data. And, maybe if you're an obstetrician or gynecologist, maybe you know this. But I find that lots of obstetricians and gynecologists do not know this. By day 22 after conception, there is acoustic apparatus beginning to emerge, and response to sound. By week 7, middle ear bone precursors are there, and there is actually discriminatory reception to sound. By week 5, the organs that are responsible for balance, vestibular function, are beginning to develop. By 14 weeks, they are completely developed. By week 7, there is response to pain and pressure receptors. By week 12, taste. So if you do amniocentesis and you put iodine in the amniotic fluid, you will see that a 12-week-old fetus will grimace. It doesn't like the taste of iodine. And actually, if you make a loud sound like this, it'll take its fetal hands and cover its ear, in utero. You play Vivaldi, it'll go into bliss. By week 12, there is olfactory response. This is the data on developmental milestones, that there is a lot of things happening. There's a whole consciousness unfolding very early on. There's a soul that's trying to incarnate into existence. There's also some very interesting data about the effects of toxic sounds on the unborn child. So now we know there is response to sound by day 22. What are we doing with this knowledge? What kind of responsibility do we have to this soul that is trying to incarnate into the material plane of existence? Imagine a typical situation in an inner city where you have a single mother, teenage, no income, lot of stress, and an inner city with sounds of violence. Just go to downtown Los Angeles and spend a night there, and the sounds you'll hear are sirens, police alarms, ambulances, gunshots. That's the kind of sound that the unborn child is hearing. So neuroassociative conditioning starts. The mother is having an argument with her husband or with whoever, and she's releasing stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. There's all kinds of physiological effects. There's a gunshot in the background. She's screaming, he's screaming. Somebody bangs the door. All this is being ingested and metabolized by this unborn child. And the study shows that afterwards, when this child is born, you just have to repeat the sound, bang a door, and the child goes into rage. The child goes into very violent behavior. So the data suggests that the schooling for criminal behavior begins before we are born. And what do we do with criminals? We put them in jail and we do all kinds of things. The fact is that that personality for criminal behavior is being schooled even before birth. It's a huge thing to think about, because right now, particularly in the last few years, if you've kept up with the headlines, you find there's an unprecedented incidence of criminal behavior, violent behavior in children. And the reason may be what's happening during this period. So we've thought a lot about it. We've discussed a lot about it. We've had some pilot programs. We're working with midwives. And in fact, we now have a pilot project that we're just beginning with teenage single mothers as well. I think there is an opportunity here, a challenge here, to literally influence a whole generation if we did things right. So what I'd like to do is tell you about this program that we're calling Magical Beginnings and Enchanted Lives. I think this is one of the most exciting things we're doing. I think it is something that we actually need to take responsibility for. And I also think that both violence in society as well as enlightenment in our civilization depends on a critical mass of collective behavior. When you have a critical mass of people who are born or have that tendency or predisposition to violence, then all of society reflects that violence. And if you have a critical mass of people who desire enlightenment, then all of society will reflect that. And just now we're in a very interesting phase of scientific discovery where we find that we have the knowledge, we have the tools to influence that critical mass. And we're going to do it. We're going to use every means possible. This is a program that will involve principally midwives, general people in the general population. We hope to ultimately involve doctors. You know, doctors are the last ones always that get involved. And I want David to tell you about what we're doing at this moment.
So unlike the creations that this program is designed to help, which take about 9 months from start to finish, the Magical Beginnings course has taken about 9 years. We're really excited about this program because we really feel that it addresses needs at many different levels. You know, the prevailing birth education program, which is Lamaze in America, really was developed in the 50s and has not been substantially changed over that time. There's been some variations on it, but still in most healthcare systems, that's the prevailing mode. And the focus has always been on birth education classes, really just on the birth process. So very little understanding of how important the experiences of the mother and the unborn child are long before the experience of the birth process. So it's a wonderful 7-lesson course that really covers all the bases. We cover everything that you would possibly need to know in a traditional birth preparation class. So we've actually developed a whole new set of breathing exercises which are much more in tune with yogic breathing, pranayama, which are more natural and very centering. There's a lot of information about using all the 5 senses throughout the pregnancy so that the baby is getting this nurturing influence really from the very start. There's a couple lessons just on the medical aspects because we really think it's important that people are prepared for all possibilities. There are important lessons on nutrition using some of the principles, most of the principles that we've been discussing here, but adapted to women with pregnancy. We have a terrific yoga program just for pregnancy that was developed with this course from one of the really experienced midwives in San Diego who's also a yoga instructor. There's a whole lesson just designed to teach mom and dad how to communicate in a healthy way. We use all the senses, aromatherapy, music therapy, and then a lot of basic preparation for the delivery itself, including toward the end a special massage that's really been classically used in India for many years. So we really think it's a great program. There's a lot of enthusiasm nationwide right now. Many hospitals, as they hear about this, are becoming interested, and we think it's going to really change the way that people look at the whole process of pregnancy, delivery. You know, I used to have the thought, particularly when I first began studying Ayurveda, that I was taught in Western medicine that if someone came to me saying, you know, I'm just not feeling that well, I don't have the energy level that I'm used to having, not sleeping that well at night, I'm getting these funny little aches and pains all the time, these tingling feelings, my digestion isn't as good as I would like it to be. And because I didn't have a clue what to do about these problems, I would put on my professorial hat and I'd say, well, let's make sure that we're not dealing with something serious, which was really a way of stalling. So we'd do some blood tests or some other evaluations, and of course everything would come back normal. And then I'd see the patient again, and then I'd say, well, good news, everything looks fine. And I would feel like I've done my job. But the person, of course, was not helped by that experience. I almost started thinking that what I was saying is, listen, whatever's wrong with you is too subtle for me to do anything about. So do you mind going away, and when it gets to be something really serious, then come back and see me, and then maybe we can intervene in some way. And I think it's just because Western medicine, at least recently, didn't recognize that there is a spectrum of health to death, that we can be vibrantly healthy, where our doshas are balanced, our agnis are strong, our dhatus and malas are functioning well, and our mind, senses, and soul are filled with bliss. That's on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have people with, metastatic cancer or severe the results of multiple heart attacks, really just waiting to have their final exhalation. And then most of us are really on this whole range in between, so that health and life are really part of the same spectrum. And Western medicine kind of has this gulf where on this side there's life and on this side there's disease. And we don't really understand how someone gets from this state of not quite so well to someone who comes in with a cancer or with a heart attack or with rheumatoid arthritis. And this is really where Ayurveda has so much to offer, because it recognizes these progressive stages of illness and really encourages us to focus on problems before they arise. Most of what we focus on in Western medicine, which I fully support, is early detection. So when we do pap smears, when we do screening for cholesterol, when we do stools for guaiac, when we measure PSA levels, when we do mammograms, what we're really trying to do is detect that very early stage of the problem when it's already become a disease. But as we're recognizing more and more, there's many things we can do to prevent disease. We spent $30 billion over the last 26 years trying to treat cancer. We have not impacted one iota the survival from this disease. So maybe now, I think what we could have done with that $30 billion, could have had everybody becoming magic of healing instructors in the universe. Focus on prevention, and maybe we don't have to be trying to put out the fire so much down the road. So again, the Western model, health is when you can't find a disease. Yeah? Blood tests are normal, your X-ray is normal, MRI scan is normal, you're healthy. How come I don't feel that well? Well, I don't know, but everything checks out fine. Whereas the Vedic model really is disease arises when health is not vibrant and lively in the physiology. So that's what we need to do, is keep raising the level of wellness, raising the level of consciousness, so that really the only state of health, the only true state of health in Ayurveda is enlightenment. Because that's the only time that we identify ourselves with something which is timeless, beyond the possibility of death. And that's really what health is. So, what are the basic components? These are said to be the 4 pillars of health: strong digestion, good elimination, sound sleep, and in women, regular menstruations. If any one of these pillars is weak, according to Ayurveda, eventually it's going to manifest down the road as some more serious health concern. There's really 3 components to the digestive process. In Ayurveda, it's known as Dipan, Pachana, Anulomana. Dipan, D-E-E-P-A-N, it means the first stage of digestion, where your stomach acid, your pancreatic enzymes are going to work to break it down. It's Dipan. It's actually related to the word deep, which means light and heat. So Dipan is the first phase. Pachanan is the phase where we begin to absorb those nutrients. And Anulomana means that which eliminates the toxicity. So digestion, absorption, elimination, all 3 phases need to be healthy, because it's that food out of which we create the substance of our minds and our bodies, the energy that we need to function. If any of those start to go off, if you're getting heartburn regularly, if you're feeling like you're not absorbing your food very well, if your bowels are irregular, then it's an early stage of illness. If you went to your doctor and said, I'm just not moving my bowels regularly, most of the time she would say, well, how often are you moving them? Oh, only every few days. That's fine, that's normal. But Ayurveda would say that's one of the early stages of illness. And if you focus on that now and get that moving normally, you're going to prevent problems down the road. Sleeping soundly. It's so important that you get that deep level of rest. Up until fairly recently, human beings, and we're going to have a whole session on this, follow the rhythms of nature. We didn't have electrical lights and alarm clocks. And so we evolved in accordance with these rhythms, with these cycles in nature. We woke up around sunrise. We went to sleep shortly after sunset. And that's really how all of our hormonal patterns were developed, evolved. So that if you look at almost every hormone in the body, it goes through a circadian rhythm. You get a certain hormone secretion of cortisol early in the morning, which slows down later in the day. Prolactin, growth hormone, endorphins. All these different hormones have a rhythm throughout the day. The more that we listen to that, the more that we will feel healthy. Some studies that I read about when I was a medical student, and actually, I think they were from the University of Chicago Sleep Lab with Dr. Rechtschaffen, showed that you can sleep 8 hours from 1 in the morning till 9 in the morning. And you can sleep 8 hours from 10 at night till 6 in the morning. And the quality of rest, if you get to bed earlier, is much greater than the quality of rest if you get to bed later. So even though the total length of time is the same, you don't feel as rested because you're increasingly out of sync with these natural hormonal patterns that have taken millions of years to evolve. And it's very common when people are feeling overwhelmed in their lives, if there's some stress that they feel they don't have any ability to really cope with effectively, for the sleep to be one of the first things to be disturbed. So it's another expression of the earliest stages of illness. And then again, another part of this cycle is the menstrual cycle in women. And so that should be smooth and regular. Stress really can influence that balance. So it's another early sign of imbalances. And if you're not eating well, eliminating well, sleeping well, and menstruating well, then it means there's some work to do. And by focusing on that, you can immediately improve a person's quality of life and ultimately reduce the possibilities of more serious illness down the road. Now, this I think is one of the most profound concepts in Ayurveda, which is this understanding that disease goes through stages of progression, and that the earliest stages of progression are almost entirely just in consciousness. So you can feel not so good even before you express it as anything that anyone objectively can measure. But the way that Western medicine is currently oriented, because it's so materially based, it's still based upon this old paradigm of seeing is believing, that if we can't see it, if we can't objectify it right now, then it doesn't exist. So, and now we have PET scans and functional MRI imaging and a whole lot of new, more sophisticated ways of seeing subtle fluctuations in physiology and biochemistry. And then we start to believe that these concerns that previously were psychosomatic, now they're not just psychosomatic, because now we can see that there's a little blip on an MRI scan. And so we're beginning to recognize that things that in the past we didn't pay much attention to, there's probably some real validity to them. This is really the core of Ayurveda. So it said that every illness goes through these 6 stages, or has the potential of going through these 6 stages. Hopefully we identify it at the earlier stage and we keep it from progressing on to the more serious stages. So accumulation is the first stage, and that really means accumulation of a dosha. You may never notice this. If you're healthy, you may never really notice that your vata is a little bit aggravated or a little bit accumulated at that point. Some of this just has to do with the season. So if you're outside all day in 100-degree weather, your pitta is going to be accumulated. Now, if you do the right things, if you don't go home and then eat 3 bowls full of steaming hot soup, turn on your heat, and take a hot bath, probably your body will naturally reestablish its balance so that the pitta hasn't accumulated to a point where it's going to move on to the next phase. But all the doshas tend to have a self-perpetuating process, in that when vata starts to get aggravated, say you're under a little bit of stress, you have a lot of things to do the next couple weeks. So vata's a little bit aggravated, and then because you're starting to worry about all the things you have to do, then you start having more difficulty sleeping. So that aggravates the vata further. And then, since you're not sleeping, you figure, well, I might as well do some extra work. So you start staying up later to accomplish more things, and then your schedule starts to get off, so you start eating at irregular times. And so it keeps kind of spiraling and spiraling until it reaches these next phases. So it's really important when you are aware of these subtle shifts, even throughout the day, when you notice yourself not feeling really balanced and really centered, pause, look at what's happening in your life, and make the correction early. If left unchecked, accumulation moves into aggravation. And aggravation is usually at the point where you will notice something, but no one else in the universe could notice it. So it's purely on the level of consciousness. It may be, I'm just having this funny little headache. It's not really a headache, but my thinking's just a little bit off today. Or, I just feel a little bit heavy in my digestive tract today. Or, it seemed like I had to go to the bathroom, but I couldn't quite move. Just these very subtle things. Now, dissemination is really a more advanced state which raises the red flag. Dissemination usually means there's something systemically wrong at that point, expressed most commonly as a sense of not feeling well, of not having enough energy, of having some vague problem focusing or concentrating. There's that sense, I think we've all had it, of just being a little bit separated from your life, like there's a cloud in your life. And that means that this imbalance and this accumulation and this aggravation has now disseminated. And this is certainly an important time that we should look at our lives and stop whatever it is that we're doing. If that means we take off a day of work, get some extra rest, eat healthy, go on a juice fast for that day, make certain that we're getting in our meditations to full time, take a yoga class, walk in the park, pet our dog, call up whoever it is that you've been ruminating about and clear that emotional distress. But when it hits that point of dissemination, it's time to really pay attention. Because if not, it'll move into the next phase, which is localization. And localization means that now this disturbed dosha, this disturbed imbalanced state, has found some weak point in your physiology to accumulate at that spot. So if you had trauma as a child and you have a weak ankle and you've gotten to this point, you may then begin to feel some nagging, aching pain in that old injury. Or if you've had always a weak digestion, that may be where you start to get heartburn, feeling that localized expression of that imbalance. Or if it's a short-term thing, you may end up getting a cold, really feeling like you're getting congested at that point. So when we move into that localization phase, it means you've ignored 3 previous levels of warning. It's not uncommon for a person to have a localized concern, but still not to quite convince your doctor. I used to have this problem with one of my cars, is that it would always have this problem with this electrical system, but as soon as I got it to the shop, it stopped doing it. And he'd look at me like, oh, sure, And this happens a lot when people come to their doctors. I've been having this swollen feeling in my wrist. It looks like, well, it looks so fine. No, but it was really swollen this morning. Okay, come back when it's full-blown. And so it's clearly manifesting, but it's still perhaps not crossed over into something that we would call a disease. Although at level 5, probably we would find a Latin name to place upon it. Okay? But then by the time you get to level 6, it's there. No one will argue with it. And then this is when Western medicine has all of its wonderful weapons to try to get you back down to less than 5. this is why Western medicine is so great at level 5 and level 6, because for the most part, here someone comes in with a 55-year-old man comes in with his first acute myocardial infarction, and the families are saying, we don't know what happened. He was so healthy. He's always been so healthy. And then you say, well, so healthy, what does that mean? Well, he's been trying to cut back on his smoking, but he never had any problem with the smoking. Okay, so he's been eating 3 hamburgers a day, but he's never had any problem with it. Okay, he doesn't exercise, but he's never had any problem with it. So we've been thinking about this as being so healthy because he hasn't had EKG changes before. But really, there's plenty of warning signs that we've just ignored. So the farther along on this scale we let something get, the harder it is to reverse it. So when someone comes to us and says, I have a brain tumor, or I have cancer, I have had 3 heart attacks, I have rheumatoid arthritis, for the last 20 years, what can Ayurveda do? We're very humble about what we can do, because it's been progressing for this long that there's nothing in the next 5 minutes, or probably 5 months, that's going to make a substantial impact on the disease. Now, we certainly can still help a person get in touch with their true selves. So whatever the body is doing at that point, we can certainly still provide relief and help the person get through that level of fear and distress. But in every system of medicine that I'm aware of, everybody eventually dies. So you can't expect miracles when something has gone on for a significant period of time. What does Ayurveda say about longevity? It says most people should be able to live about 120 years if you choose to do that. And what should be the mode of exiting the body? It should be a conscious exit. So what causes us to become ill? It's said if there's one cause of illness in Ayurveda, it's due to prajna parad. Isn't that a fun word? Prajna parad. It's traditionally translated as the mistake of the intellect. Okay? Now, it's been looked at many levels. So what are the mistakes of the intellect? Well, one mistake of the intellect is you forgot to put your pizza away the night before. You come in the morning, you're in a rush, you're hungry, you look at that cold pizza sitting out there, you think, okay, I'll eat it. And you eat it, and then 4 hours later you have food poisoning. So that was a mistake of your intellect. Or you go out with someone the first time, you have unprotected sex, and you come down with gonorrhea. So that was a mistake of your intellect. So on a crude level, it's those choices that we make that we pay for down the road. But what's the ultimate mistake of the intellect? The ultimate mistake of the intellect is forgetting that the knower, the process of knowing, and that which is known are really 3 expressions of the same field of unity consciousness. That ultimately, the mistake of the intellect means forgetting that we are spirit temporarily disguising ourselves as individuals. Because as soon as we forget our wholeness, we have entered into the realm of fear. And fear is the first cause in consciousness of every illness. So that's why enlightenment is the only true state of health, and ultimately enlightenment is the only cure for illness. Because it's the only time that we can really, once and for all, put to rest this potential for suffering. So the wonderful aspect of Ayurveda is it's not just an alternative science. It's not an allopathic science that says symptom remedy, symptom remedy. The whole value of Ayurveda is to keep bringing people back into that state of wholeness. And all these things that we do through food, through senses, through herbs, through massage, through yoga, it's all really to just remind the person that their true nature is one of wholeness. And then whether or not the disease gets fixed, the person gets healed. And that's really what the goal of Ayurveda is. There is certainly this recognition that karma plays a role in illness. Karma means things that have happened in our past. But I've never read or heard anything in the Vedic literature that ever casted this sense of blame onto people. You know? So why is a child born with cerebral palsy? Probably something in the past led to this circumstance because there's some lessons or something that needed to be learned by this person. But that's a different way of looking at it than, well, they obviously did something bad in the past, therefore they're being punished. First of all, it does no one any good, even if we know that we've done something that led to this illness. It doesn't do any good to blame the person because we're all doing our absolute best at any moment. In retrospect, we look back and say, God, I can't believe I did that. You know, I could have made a different choice at that time. But at the time, at this moment, every one of us is trying to do our best. And so, for one, it does absolutely no good to blame anyone. And two, most of the time, or a good part of the time, we really don't have a clue why things happen. It's very easy for us to say, well, of course he had a heart attack. You know, he smoked 2 packs of cigarettes per day, he ate red meat every day, never exercised, plus the guy was a jerk. Of course he got a heart attack. Why do we say that? We say that because it's a defense. It's an ego defense that says, well, since I don't smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, that can't happen to me. But every one of us in this room will at some point be facing an illness that will take our lives. And so what we want is to have that compassion that we would want for ourselves with everybody else that we encounter. So whatever we've done up till this point, we can't change that. What we can change is, in this moment, new choices, taking responsibility for what we're going to be doing from this point on, and using it as a learning experience. So there's this recognition that things happen in the past, but I think the best expression that I've heard in the Upanishads is that unfathomable is the field of karma. Unfathomable is the field of karma. Because at any one moment, explain why you're here right now. Why are you sitting in this room right now? Think about it. I mean, just think about all the things that had to go into you being here right at this moment. You couldn't possibly calculate it. It's unfathomable. And so it's no less unfathomable why someone gets leukemia, or why you have a heart attack or a stroke. You know, we may come up with a few little linear, rational reasons for it, but it's really not a very sound way of explaining the reality. So humility is, in our minds, a necessary qualification of anyone entering into this realm of Ayurveda. There's lots of classifications of illness according to Ayurveda, and in general, Vata, being the mischievous dosha, is the one that creates the greatest number of illnesses. There are half as many Kapha disorders as Pitta. There's half as many Pitta as Vata. And if you look at a practice, you'll see that this is the proportion of people coming to you with complaints. So people with Kapha complaints, mostly they want to lose weight, they're having allergies or congestion. Those are the bulk of the Kapha concerns. Diabetes is a Kapha disease. Pitta problems, they're more common. Inflammatory conditions. Vata problems, they're very common. Everything from insomnia, anxiety, headaches, to digestive disturbances, problems with elimination. They're quite common. Once I learned these terminologies, I decided I was no longer a board-certified neurologist. I was a board-certified vatologist. So, now, let's look at it at a more physiological level. We've talked about this term Agni. Agni, again, ignite. It's that digestive power. It's what allows us to consume the universe. It not only creates the energy that we need, but ultimately is involved in the process of creating the tissues. When the Agnis are strong and doing their job, in addition to creating healthy tissues and giving us the energy that we want, it also is said in Ayurveda to create a very subtle substance known as ojas. Ojas. Ojas is one of these concepts in Ayurveda which is almost too subtle for us to really make sense of. It's even said in Ayurveda that ojas is equally in the realm of consciousness as it is in the realm of matter. It's right on that border between consciousness and matter, right on that interface between mind and body. The way that they talk about it is it's like the light at the doorway. You have a light in the threshold of the doorway. It shines its light into the house. It shines its light into the environment. It's said that we're born with a few drops of ojas in our heart. And then every time that we have a life-supporting experience, someone shares with us genuine love, we eat something nourishing, we create another drop of ojas. And every time we have a life-damaging experience, someone hurts our feelings, we eat something that's not good for us, we don't take good care of ourselves, we deplete a drop of ojas. And that when we've depleted every drop of ojas in our system, then we die. And so ojas is a kind of final expression of healthy behaviors in both mind and body. When the agnis are strong, as a slight byproduct of whatever other metabolic pathway is occurring, ojas is created. When the agnis are weak, instead of creating ojas, we store that incompletely metabolized experience in our mind-body physiology. And that incompletely digested experience is known in Ayurveda as ama. 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 If you had to say what is the cause of illness on this physiological level, it's weak agnis leading to this accumulation of ama. And ama gets deposited in the shrotas, channels of circulation. Okay. When these channels of circulation, and they can be subtle, so it's not just coronary arteries or colon, but even these 72,000 nadis. So it's at this whole range of material to consciousness. When the shrotas or the nadis get plugged, then the ojas is not able to circulate. Ojas has two primary effects on cells. One effect is that it nourishes the cell. Another effect is that it reminds the cell that its existence, its reason for existence, is to serve the entire mind-body physiology. When ojas is not able to reach the cell, then the cell loses its source of nourishment and it loses its connectedness to the whole. So one of two things happens. Either the cell degenerates, so all the degenerative illnesses from arthritis to Alzheimer's disease are said to be a result of ama, because ama is preventing the ojas from nurturing that cell. Or because it's lost its connectedness with the whole, the cell begins to take on its own ego. And when it takes on its own ego, it no longer is concerned about the well-being of everything else. And in that case, it keeps replicating, and that, according to Ayurveda, is the origin of cancer. So we want to keep ojas flowing. We want to reduce the production of ama by keeping these agnis strong so that the shrotas stay clear and that value of nourishment and reminding of the holistic nature of every cell in the body is kept lively. Ojas is also said to enliven something called bala. Bala means immunity. Immunity. So when ojas is flowing through the system, then our immune cells are also reminded of their true purpose in life, and they're energized, they're nourished and nurtured so that they're doing their job efficiently. Although ojas is this very subtle concept, and I don't think we'll ever be able to do a ojas level in the blood, it's really an interesting and essential concept in Ayurveda. Let's talk about what we can do then to reduce the quantity of ama. And really that means we want to enliven the agnis. When you enliven the agnis, you create more ojas, you automatically digest ama. So what do you want to look at? You want to look at all the things that we bring into our body, into our minds, and what we can do to make certain that we're digesting those experiences. What is digestion? Digestion is the process of bringing something in, breaking it down, extracting what we need and eliminating what we don't need. We bring it in, we break it down, we take what we need, we release what we don't need. If that's happening appropriately, then we will stay healthy. So we eat something, we break it down, take what we need, eliminate what we don't need. We have an emotional experience. Someone comes up to us and says, I think you're really arrogant. You can take what you need. Okay, maybe I've been acting a little bit arrogantly. I'll take that, but I'll not accept the part which is that person's issue. So we can carry ama at our physical level, at our emotional level, relationships, and it's really essential that whatever that level is, we identify it, we metabolize it, we clear it out of our system so that those channels of circulation are open and we're not continuously stuck with the baggage of the past. So food, we want to make sure the food that we're taking in is healthy. Yes, if our agnis are really strong, we can convert poison into nectar. But why waste the energy? So eat things that are healthy, that are delicious, that are nurturing. It's possible to have healthy vegetarian food that's delicious, that you feel fulfilled with. So it's not complicated. Water, as much as possible. We should see the water in our environment as our collective blood, our collective rasa. And so we should really be increasingly concerned about what's going into our water supply and what's going into our bodies. And so it's really essential that that life blood in our environment is kept pure. Substances, this is where we can start to really take personal responsibility. Smoking is the major health risk of our society, and yet the incidence of smoking in our young population, in women, continues to rise. Excessive alcohol use, recreational chemicals, these are all substances that we bring into our bodies, and we pay a price for it. We have to eliminate toxicity from all these areas. We have to eliminate toxic relationships. And we'll talk about how you can identify a toxic relationship, not that you need for me to tell you. But basically, if you can't purify it, if you can't make a toxic relationship into a healthy relationship, then there's no reason to continue to tolerate it. You put your effort into improving it, into making it healthy, and if it's obvious, as far as you can see into the future, it's continued to be toxic, then don't tolerate it. We see a lot of people who are eating very healthy, are being very careful about their diet, but are in the most unbelievably toxic relationships, which they tolerate day after day after day. And eventually that ama is going to result in illness. And we shouldn't tolerate toxic emotions in our own life. Toxic emotions are things like resentment, ongoing frustration, blaming, guilt. We need to look at these toxic emotions, which are really carried in our manomaya kosh, in our emotional body, and do what needs to be done to identify, to eliminate, to free ourselves up from that, because we're giving away our freedom. And freedom ultimately is what allows us to become enlightened. So, just very briefly then, what are all the things we can do? We can balance the doshas. We'll continue to talk about different ways to do that. We already know we can balance it through meditating regularly, eating appropriately, using the right aroma, doing the right exercise. We'll learn more about how to use massage. So through all the five senses, through our conscious use of food, we can balance the doshas. Follow the daily routines. Getting to bed at the right time, eating at the right time, going to sleep at the right time. We take time for meditation every day. We want to make certain that our agnis are optimal. That means we eat right foods. There are certain substances we can do to stimulate our agni. We talked about them a little bit yesterday. The more heating spices, fresh ginger, trikatu, which is the combination of dry ginger, black pepper, and long pepper, cloves, cinnamon, fennel, cumin, coriander. These are all spices that really enliven our digestive power. So again, as much as possible, we want to really create a healing environment. And we want to make choices that we know are healthy for us. That doesn't mean we should be compulsive and rigid. In fact, rigidity is an ama-producing activity. As Deepak mentioned on day one, our favorite expression, which anyone who works with our organization knows, you have to try to imbibe this principle, is that infinite flexibility is the secret to immortality. And so it doesn't mean I'm never going to eat such and such, or if I don't get to bed by 10 o'clock, I'm going to self-destruct. It means you have your intention on balance, the right choices, and then you have a certain flexible attitude about the whole thing. That whatever's happening at this moment, it's something that nature is organizing, and that we can metabolize it. We can use it for our own advantage. Ayurveda has a number of ways of identifying and releasing accumulated toxicity from the past on every level: physical, emotional, spiritual. We talked about Agni. Everybody knows Agni now. When it's strong, we take what we need. We release what we don't need. When it's weak, whatever we take in, we don't fully use it. If we can't eliminate it, we store it somewhere. The more that it stores, the more that it creates a burden for our mind-body physiology. So we want to enhance the Agni, eliminate accumulated Ama. Now, how do you know when you have Ama? If you're alive and an adult, you probably have some Ama. Unless you've had the fortune of living in the purest environment on earth, eating only healthy foods from the moment you were born or even before, were raised by totally enlightened parents, and the only people you ever encountered in your life were other great enlightened beings. So since that's only happening in a few major cities in the United States these days, the chances are that you have some type of Ama at some level. When it's more advanced and more expressed, these are the symptoms that people who have a substantial amount of accumulated Ama often experience. Their breath doesn't seem that fresh. There's a sense that even if they haven't eaten anything bad that day, there's still this sense of some putrefaction or toxicity in their system. Look at your tongue first thing in the morning. It's like your dipstick into your Ama pot. So if you look at your tongue and it's really coated in white, it means that you probably have been accumulating Ama in your physiology. If it's fairly pink and clean, that's a good sign. When you clean your tongue, it doesn't mean that you're eliminating the Ama in your body by scraping off your tongue. It's sort of like the dipstick. You don't fill up your dipstick by just adding more oil to the dipstick. So it's a way of just getting a sense of how much Ama you're accumulating. But if every morning when you wake up your tongue is coated, really start looking at what's going on in your life. One of the first things that happens is the Ama dulls the digestive fire. It's one of these self-reinforcing processes that when Agni is weak, Ama accumulates, and when Ama accumulates, the fire of digestion also gets weak. And so when people say, I just don't have an appetite, I'm just not hungry, I kind of have to force myself to eat, that's a good sign that there is an accumulation of Ama. Same thing with your digestion, just slow and dull and sluggish. So irritable bowel often has Ama as a major component. This kind of generalized aches and pain. So chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, fibromyositis, all these kind of non-specific mind-body imbalance disorders that Western doctors throw up their hands with because we don't know what to do with it. These are all expressions of disseminated Ama. If you read the descriptions of Ama accumulation, they sound very much like descriptions of people with chronic fatigue or chronic fibromyalgia. So Ama's, you think of it, it's just kind of gunking up the system. Energy is not able to flow freely, so whatever energy you have has to force its way to accomplish your tasks. Now, Ama accumulation is able to override dosha, so that if someone has substantial Ama, they're going to be very unresponsive to any efforts to balance the doshas until you've been able to reduce the level of Ama in someone's system. So if someone has a Vata imbalance and has a lot of Ama, before you really start on the Vata specifically, you want to reduce the level of Ama in the system.